Difficult verses for some, but for many goat, they claim they can do it. They claim they can do it. What do you say? What do you say of the common fish and the common goat? How do you have feelings about the common goat and the common fish?
Well, for me, goat versus fish is one of those questions that has plagued man, obviously, for centuries. But to me, it's a very simple answer.
Ah, you have an answer for goat versus fish. But before you answer goat versus fish, one called Albamani, one fence Italy producerly, one Albamani, that, though it sits on the fence, does help to spread the word of goat versus fish, and for that we celebrate this fence sitter. Yes, how is goat versus fish sounding? Yes, is it sounding well? Is goat versus fish is speaking now? Yes, how can we hear goat versus fish?
It is verses. In fact, both of y'all have been verses in for a while.
Ah, it is still verses, yes, and all the
verses.
And the leveling verses, This
is at the leveling verses at 12.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is all very goat versus fish. It is all very goat versus fish.
So, ready when you are with the goat versus fish fishiness, goatness.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Goat versus fish will be beginning now. There are some things that goat versus fish must say to the ones who listen to goat versus fish, yes.
So we haven't, so the first part.
Pre-verses.
Gotcha.
Yes, it was. But there is always a verses that is before the verses, and a verses that comes after the verses. There's always another verses, yes. Secret pre-verses.
It's all verses.
It is all verses. Yes, these are the verses of goat versus fish.
It's a lot like that movie Inception, where it's verses inside of a verses, inside of a bigger verses.
Ah, that does sound like goat versus fish. Yes. Goat versus fish will have to see this moving visage that you do call Inception. Yes, we shall see if it is goat or if it is fish, or perhaps it is goat versus fish. Perhaps it is goat versus fish. Will you say goat versus fish with goat versus fish?
I will.
Goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. What about goat versus fish versus goat versus fish versus goat versus fish
versus goat versus fish versus goat
versus fish
versus goat
versus fish
versus the goat
versus fish
versus fish
versus goat.
Yes, it is goat versus fish. It is fish versus goat. Oh, it is all goat versus fish. Oh, this is very pleasant verses. This is very pleasant verses. Oh, you have the goat fish upon you. You have the goat fish upon you.
I do. I wear the garb of the unification of a goat versus fish world. Universe, actually.
You know, goat versus fish suspected that this unity of goat and fish might be very goat versus fish for you, yes? Not because, yes, it is goat versus fish, the goat fish, but perhaps because you are having trouble to be choosing goat or fish. But we are getting ahead of the verses. We are getting ahead of the verses. Goat versus fish shall speak now. Goat versus fish shall speak now, and then goat versus fish shall say to you. And now goat versus fish speaks to a one. And that will be when we are beginning the speaking verses between you and goat versus fish. But for now, let it to be goat versus fish, simply speaking as goat versus fish, yes?
Yes.
In the beginning, there was goat versus fish. The goat fish. And goat versus fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. Welcome to the Goat vs. Fish podcast, recorded at the world-famous Comedy Store, Los Angeles, a place of Goat vs. Fish. It is a place of Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish speaks directly to you, speaks directly to you. You have many questions, yes? Who is Goat vs. Fish? What is Goat vs. Fish? Why is Goat vs. Fish? But there is only one question. Are you goat or are you fish? Ponder it now. Who shall triumph, the goat or the fish? Let us find out on this versus of Goat versus Fish. This versus, Goat versus Fish, speaks to a one, speaks to another one. And what do the ones call this one? What do the ones call this one?
This one is called Brett.
Ah, it is called Brett. Ah, pleasant to verses with you, one called Brett.
Yes, it's pleasant to verses with you, Goat versus Fish. It's a very big honor for me and something that when I moved to Los Angeles, California, I moved here to become closer to Goat versus Fish. A lot of people move to Hollywood to maybe to be a star in a movie or something like that. But to me, that was far less important than really getting close to and feeling the warmth and the understanding and the depth and the breadth of the knowledge that is Goat versus Fish. And this is where it happens.
Ah, you seek Goat versus Fish. You seek Goat versus Fish.
I sought Goat versus Fish before I even knew that that's what I was seeking.
Ah, these are the verses. Goat versus Fish has tried to explain just those verses to so many other ones. They are looking for something, yes, but they do not even know that they are seeking verses. They are seeking the verses of Goat versus Fish, yes?
Absolutely.
What were some of the verses that you did seek that you did not know were Goat versus Fish, but now you know are Goat versus Fish?
Well, there was a time when I would chase I would be chasing the elusive high. You know, I would be out there. I would be imbibing, and I would be engorging. I would be up till all hours of the night, trying to find something that satisfied my soul. But what I did not know is that in the end, the only thing that was ever going to quiet down this mind is Goat versus Fish.
Ah, you speak of the soul and the mind. Yes, you speak of the soul and the mind.
Yes, because what is the soul and the mind if not the
goat or a fish?
And the fish?
Oh, it is goat and fish. Well, it is goat and fish.
And fish.
Ah, yes. Well, perhaps one is goat and perhaps one is fish. Do you suppose that these goat and fish, the mind goat or the mind fish and the soul goat or the soul fish, that they do often versus one another? Did you find that your mind goat would versus your soul fish, or perhaps it was fish versus goat? Was this a versus for you?
It may have been. I don't think that I was enlightened enough to even recognize it at the time, but I think my mind goat was definitely versusing my soul fish.
The goat said, "Oh, I can out-ponder, yes, the very feeling of your fish." And the fish said, "I can outfeel the very pondering of the goat." And it was all very goat versus fish.
The mind goat looked at my soul fish and said, "Why?" And my soul fish just looked back at my mind goat and said, "You ask me why, and I have an answer." And the answer, of course, is yes.
If one asks themselves why is goat versus fish, this is one of the true-false questions. It is a true-false question, perhaps the truest false question. Who is goat versus fish? What is goat versus fish? Why is goat versus fish? You have just heard these verses. Yes. Now, goat versus fish sees in you one that is not yet ready to choose goat or fish. You are with goat versus fish. You seek goat versus fish. You are seeking goat versus fish to help you to choose goat or fish, to help you to choose goat or fish. Is it so? Is it so?
It may be so. It may be so. I may have approached thinking that I already knew if I was goat or if I was fish, but I think now that what I had done coming in is make a grave mistake, and that is to think that I could think at all.
Oh, you cannot ponder. What has happened to the pondering goat? It seemed such a mighty goat.
It seems as if you're a pondering goat, but are you?
Well, goat versus fish is always pondering goat and fish. Always pondering goat and fish. That is goat versus fish. It is goat versus fish to ponder goat versus fish. Even when the ones are not saying goat versus fish and asking ones they know if they are goat or fish, they should always be pondering goat versus fish. Always ponder goat and fish.
So in my ponderings, I have decided goat versus fish for myself. But maybe what I'm saying is that now that I'm here, maybe I haven't decided at all. Maybe the reason I have sought goat versus fish out is because I thought I had made that decision, but maybe I haven't.
The choosing of goat or fish is very pleasant to goat versus fish. We shall verses together, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the verses, we shall ask you if you are a goat or a fish, and we will see. Then you shall be ready for the one true question, yes?
Yes.
But before goat versus fish does help you to choose goat or fish, would you listen to the ponderings of goat versus fish? Would you hear the very ponderings of goat versus fish?
I will listen and I will hear.
The ponderings of goat versus fish. Last verses, goat versus fish, was versing with two wands. Yes, approach these two wands, yes, to see if it could be goat versus fish, because goat versus fish is always seeking goat and fish to become goat versus fish. And goat versus fish asked one of the wands, yes, and it said that it was a goat. Oh, and it was very goat, and we did celebrate the goat. Of course, we celebrate all goat, yes. And it was goat, and it was high goat, yes. But it was not goat versus fish, because there was not yet a fish. So goat versus fish asked the other one if it was goat or fish, but it did not seem ready to choose goat or fish. Oh, it seemed as if it sat on the fence. Oh, it sat on the fence. You know the fence sitter. Oh, you know the fence sitter, how they are always not choosing goat or fish for one versus or another, yes. So goat versus fish try to say, well, at least be a goat, yes, or choose fish. Look at this goat. It is trying to versus a fish, but the one, it would lean fish. Oh, it seems that it was leaning fish, but it did not choose fish. It did not choose fish, and it was not goat versus fish. And it was not goat versus fish. Of course, all things are goat versus fish. Yes, all things are goat versus fish. Yes, within you, without you, goat versus fish, forever goat versus fish. But it did not feel goat versus fish because the one would not choose a fish. It sat on the fence. The goat had no fish to versus. And at the end of the verses, they did not even follow goat versus fish. They did not even follow goat versus fish on the Instagram or the Twitterver or all social media. Yes, they did not even follow goat versus fish. Why should goat versus fish? What is the verses? What is the verses if they do not even follow goat versus fish? If the ones will not even follow goat versus fish? The ponderings of goat versus fish. What do you say to the ponderings of goat versus fish?
I say that it sounds to me like if there is a one out there who, after remaining on the fence and being in the presence of goat versus fish, still did not follow goat versus fish on the Instagram or on the Twitter.
At GoatVsFish.
At GoatVsFish. Then I can think that the only reason that this has happened is as a true test of goat versus fish itself. And that the true fence sitter is really just a tester of goat versus fish, for which goat versus fish has passed because goat versus fish brought the story of the fence sitter and the unfollowing into the ponderings. And then that story was shared with the people. And this is what goat versus fish does. So it all worked out in the end because it was a test for goat versus fish. And goat versus fish passed the test.
High verses for you, high verses for this one that is pondering. Yes, goat versus fish has found. Yes, goat versus fish. This will be heard, yes, at quite a later verses. But goat versus fish was just at the verses of Anime Expo. Yes, at the verses of Anime Expo. Yes, and once goat versus fish spoke to not one, not two, not three, but four fence sitters. They all sat on the fence. But then later in the verses, One of those fence sitters did bring yet another to speak to Goat versus Fish. It also sat on the fence, but it followed Goat versus Fish.
Mm-hmm. See? It's working.
It is working. It is Goat versus Fish. Soon we'll all know Goat versus Fish. One by one, they follow Goat versus Fish, and it is all very Goat versus Fish.
Would you say that the Anime Expo is goat or fish?
Fish. It was undeniably fish. Congratulations, fish! We celebrate the fish! The fish, the fish, the fish did triumph. The fish did triumph at the verses of Anime Expo. Congratulations, fish. Let us evidence. Are you prepared for the verses of evidence?
I am prepared.
The verses of evidence. The verses of evidence. Let us ponder the evidence of goat or fish within you, within you, within you. Goat versus fish would like to hear an evidence of goat and an evidence of fish, and we shall consider these evidence. We shall consider these evidence, yes?
An evidence of goat is that I am a member of the Church of Satan.
Ah, the Church of Satan, they do call
Yes.
it, yes. And you do say that Satan is goat.
Satan is goat.
I have heard this from many ones that claim Satan is a goat. It is usually seen with the horn of the goat. It can be said. It can be
Yes.
said.
Yes, even if it's just symbolic in nature. Even if Satan doesn't really exist, which is the position of the Church of Satan, that non-existent deity is goat.
If it is goat, if you say it is goat, you are very much closer to this Satan one than Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish is not here. Ones who listen to say that Satan is a goat or a fish, until Goat versus Fish does meet one that is called Satan and asks it for itself if it is goat or a fish. Goat versus Fish cannot say. But this one says, this Brett one says, that being a member of the Church of Satan is evidence of goat, and it does seem to have the horn of a goat.
Yes.
What is an evidence of fish?
I am a person who is a pescatarian, which means that the only sort of meat that I eat is fish.
Consuming fish.
Consuming fish. And you know what they say. You are what you eat.
It is a versus.
So therefore,
let us hear it again for goat. What is another evidence of goat?
a second evidence for goat. I enjoy frolicking.
The frolicking of the goat, how it frolics upon the land.
Frolicking is one of my favorite things. I try to frolic a couple times a week, and that seems very goatish.
Let us see your frolic. Let us see your frolic.
I'm frolicking right now.
Ah, so you are. That is a very still frolic.
Well, frolicking, I have found, is very much a psychic activity. You can frolic anywhere, anytime. That's what makes frolicking so beautiful. If you do it in a goat-like way, then you can do it even if you were confined to a prison cell where you couldn't move. You could still frolic because you would be frolicking psychically like the goat.
There is always a frolic. There is always a frolic. Do not let anyone stop your frolic, goat. Let us hear it for fish. What is another evidence of fish?
I can swim.
Ah, the swimming of the fish. Ah,
Yes.
that is very swimming in the ocean of the fish. The goat may frolic, but the fish does swim in the sea.
We need more evidences.
One more evidence.
One more evidence.
One more evidence of goat.
One more evidence of goat. How about this? I have 2 children. They are my kids.
Ah.
And this is a name for small goats. So how could I have 2 kids if I were not goat?
But if they are a kid, would they call themselves a kid?
That would be up to them.
It would, yes, it would. It is an evidence. It is perhaps not as strong an evidence as the frolicking, yes, but it is an evidence. It is an evidence. And the final evidence of fish.
I smell
Like a fish?
like a fish. I have a fishy odor.
Ones who listen, you have heard this evidence of goat and fish, and whatever this one Brett does choose, goat or fish, let us hear from you. Let us hear from you what you say about this evidence of goat and fish, and if you think that this one is a goat or a fish, you can tell it. How could the ones tell you that they think you are a goat or a fish?
They could tweet at me at the I Brett My Pants, also on the Instagram. I Brett My Pants with a capital B for Brett, for that is my name. And you can contact me and tell me whether you think I am goat or fish.
This is your versus now. This is your versus now. Contact that one. Tell it if you think if it is a goat or a fish. Perhaps even if it chooses fish or goat, you could convince it. You could be the one that convinces it to take the side of the goat or the fish.
I was going to ask you this. Have you ever had a one who was goat and then later became fish?
Oh, yes. Oh,
Really?
yes. There have been ones who have been goat, and then they become fish. Yes, and fish that become goat, and then back to goat or fish again. It has happened. It has happened.
It's a dynamic situation.
Of course, if they are changing too much between goat and fish, that is very fence-italy. That is very fence-italy
yes.
versus for goat versus fish. Are you ready? Do you know your verses? Are you ready? Let us see.
I am ready. I am prepared.
A goat is a goat, and a fish is a...
Fish.
It is a fish! It is a fish! Celebration! Celebration! Oh, it is so wise in the ways of goat versus fish.
I was nervous there, but I got that one right.
Are you prepared for the next verses?
Yes.
5 goat and 5 fish is...
10.
I am so sorry. I am so sorry. That is not the verses. That is not the verses. 5 goat and 5 fish is goat versus fish.
Oh, right.
It is goat versus fish. It is still goat versus fish.
All right, I think I got one more chance, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Let us see if you know more of your verses than not, yes?
Okay.
One who calls itself a Capricorn is...
Goat.
I am so sorry, that is not the verses. That is not the verses. Oh, pitiable, pitiable, pitiable. The one that calls itself a Capricorn, is the perennial fence-sitter that wishes to be both goat and fish.
Of course. How could I have been so stupid?
You do get partial verses. You get partial verses because there are some who claim to be Capricorn that do say they are only goat. Yes, perhaps in defiance of the fence-sitter that would say it is both goat and fish. So you get one and some verses. One and some verses. For bretting its pants. For one bretting its pants.
I think I'm just a little nervous being in the presence of goat versus fish. I do so much better on my verses when I am at home.
Oh, your own verses. Tell us of your own verses. Yes.
I study the great goat versus fish works, and I ponder them, and I take them to my meditations, and I feel like I know my goat versus fish pretty well, and then I feel like I didn't do as well as I could have on my verses there. But I just want everyone to know that out there in goat versus fish, I am goat versus fish.
Oh, you claim to be goat versus fish?
No, it just in a overall goat versus fish.
Yes, in a goat versus fish sort of versus.
I am not. I am certainly, of course. No way. It's possible that I am actually the living embodiment of goat versus fish, but I am goat versus fish.
But let us see how well you know your own verses.
Oh.
You have spoken before of driving under the influence. Goat versus fish has heard verses from you from many verses ago about driving under the influence, yes?
Yes, I have driven under many influences.
What do you say of one who would drive under the influence of goat versus fish?
Someone who would drive under the influence of goat versus fish. DUIGVSF.
Yes.
That would be, unfortunately, a crime, and it shouldn't be as such. It should be encouraged.
There are ones who would stop those from DUIGVSF? There are ones who would stop it?
There are those. And I don't want to live in a world where they have as much power as they do. Someday, they will be celebrated for DUIGVSF.
Celebration! You have once claimed to have the very cold sea of the fish poured atop your very verses. You did call it a challenge of the ice buckets. When the sea of the fish was poured upon you, was it a feeling of returning to the sea of the fish, or was it a feeling of a goat entering the sea to versus a fish?
That was definitely a goat entering the sea to versus the fish, because the ice in the bucket was so cold that a fish wouldn't have been able to survive it. A goat, on the other hand, with its thick and furry hair, was able to shed the ice cold water away, wick it away from its skin, and stay vital and breathing.
Those are very pleasant verses. Goat versus fish was going to excitedly regale the verses of the goat that did enter the sea, yes, and did have the very cold sea of the fish that was coming off of the fur of the goat, but you have done it so well.
Thank you.
Is an atheist a goat or a fish?
Yes.
Of course it is a goat or a fish. All things are goat or fish. But is it goat or fish?
Yes.
Fence-sitterly verses. But it was 2 of 3 verses. Goat or fish? Is it a goat or is it a fish? Now, are you ready? Are you ready for goat or fish? Yes, we are bringing the verses to you. We are simply bringing all the verses to you.
I am ready.
What has 30,000 legs and 7 tits, a goat or a fish?
The race for the goat.
The race for the goat. It is goat. Celebration for goat. Frosty the Snowman, goat or fish?
Frosty the Snowman. Fish.
Fish, it is fish. How is it fish? How is it fish?
Snowman is made of snow, which is water, which is fish.
It is fish. You have heard it. 1 for the Frosty Snowman fish. Celebration for fish. Donald Duck, goat or fish?
Fence sitter.
Ooh, it is a fence sitter. Ooh, it is a fence sitter. Ooh, tell us of this fence sitter.
Many times you will see a duck in the water with its legs and its bottom half in the sea and its upper half in the air. That is goat and that is fish. That is goat and fish. That is a fence sitter.
Oh, it is a fence sitter. Oh, it is such a fence sitter. One that would even call itself a duck. That surely sits on the fence. Surely sits on the fence, yes.
Yes.
Some may even call it, some have even dared to call it a bird. They have said it is a bird. Goat versus fish does not even wish to speak of it. Goat versus goat. There is one that is now calling itself bird versus bear. It is calling itself bird versus bear.
Bird versus bear.
Yes, and it even has its own Instagram and its own Twitter. Yes.
Bird versus bear.
Dude, it's intense.
It is always saying to goat versus fish that goat versus fish is false verses, but we know who the false verses are. Yes, it is bird versus bear.
Mm-hmm. That doesn't sound right at all. If you decided that you were bird versus bear, then you couldn't be either goat or fish, which is not even possible. Therefore, the entire philosophy is built upon a foundation of sand.
That is not very goat versus fish. That is not goat versus fish.
No.
Bird versus bear is not goat versus fish.
Doesn't sound to me like they should even be able to say verses in between those two.
They should not. They should not. It is false versus.
It should just be bird or bear. That's what they're going to do, because no, that's not verses worthy.
That is even too fence-sitterly for goat versus fish. Even that is too fence-sitterly. One called Albamani, one Producerly, one. You did have something to say to goat versus fish?
They say the same about you, so that's just strange stuff, dude.
They say it about goat versus fish?
Yes, they do. They say that goat versus fish is a false versus and that it's a fence sitter.
Ah, fence sitters. Fence sitters always accusing goat versus fish of sitting on the fence.
That proves that they are fence sitters.
It does. It does. They do sit on the fence.
Mm-hmm.
Doug Stanhope, goat or fish?
Goat.
It is goat. It is goat. This Brett My Pants one does say that one called Doug Stanhope is a goat. And you would know because you have spent many verses with this one.
I have spent many verses with Doug Stanhope, and I would call him a goat for one reason. The acronym with the letters of GOAT, G-O-A-T, have been used to describe someone who is the greatest of all time.
The greatest of all time! The greatest of all time. And you say that this is the Stanhope one.
Well, that doesn't have anything to do with Doug Stanhope. Doug also likes to eat tin cans, so he's a goat.
Ah, that does sound very goat. Oh, that does sound very goat, yes.
Yeah. He drinks a lot of beer, and then he eats the can that it came in, and that seems like a goaty thing to do. But he's part fish, but he's mostly goat, making him goat.
These are strange verses to goat versus fish.
Yes?
One is all goat or one is all
Really?
fish. A goat may have fishy verses about it. Yes, it may be a fishy goat, but if it is goat, then it is all goat.
Okay, he's all goat, but he's a fishy goat.
Fishy goat. Oh, a fishy goat. Oh, fishy goat. Goat versus fish hopes to one versus speak with that one that you call a goat. Do you foresee in the future verses of goat versus fish that goat versus fish shall ever speak to that one that calls itself Doug Stanhope?
I foresee it.
You foresee it.
I foresee it.
This calls for celebration! 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 Of course, goat versus fish does not want you to think one that calls itself Brett My Pants that goat versus fish is not pleased to be speaking with you, of course, yes.
I can tell. It's obvious to me that you have welcomed me in here with open hooves and fins.
Yes.
And I couldn't be more welcomed, and I can feel it, and I appreciate it. Goat versus fish has welcomed me, and I am so excited that I Brett my pants.
Oh, you have done it. You have become your very self.
I have become myself.
Ah, that is very pleasant to Goat versus Fish. Always helping the ones to find themselves.
That's true.
Yes.
I feel sorry for the next podcast, but I Brett my pants.
And it was written that one called Brett My Pants did Brett its very pants. Are the pants goat or fish? Well, it is part of one that is called Brett its pants, and soon we shall know if it is goat or a fish. But now is the final verses for you. The final verses, the verses of the choosing. Are you ready for the verses of choosing?
I am ready for the verses of the choosing.
The verses of choosing. Goat and Fish had just come from the mighty verses that was called Anime Expo. The fish did triumph over the goat. The fish did triumph over the goat, though there were many verses within. And Goat and Fish were tired from that verses. But after they did rest and gained the strength of Goat and Fish, a verses occurred to them. Is it not Goat versus Fish, said the goat. Is it not Goat versus Fish, said the fish. And the goat, atop the tallest land of the goat, did leap from the land of the goat, and the fish from the deepest sea of the fish did rise through the sea of the fish, and they did come together, and they were coming together, and it was going to be Goat versus Fish, it was going to be Goat versus Fish. But then they turned to one, such as you, for aid in Goat versus Fish, for the verses could continue for all verses. It is forever Goat versus Fish. You will choose from Goat versus Fish. If you choose goat, then you aid the goat. If you choose fish, then you aid the fish. There shall be several choosings. Let us see how we verses. What is your first choosing? Choosing verses.
My first selection, fence sitter.
Fence sitter. Well, then, it seems that the one that was observing the verses of the goat and fish was a fence sitter that did not choose goat or fish. Describe this fence sitter in this verses. Describe that fence sitter that was watching goat and fish.
This fence sitter that was watching goat and fish saw in the goat and the fish many great qualities, and being a fence sitter, had to sit on the fence.
And it did sit on the fence, and it did sit on the fence, but it was still not knowing if the goat or the fish would triumph, if the goat or the fish would triumph. The second choosing.
The second selection is goat.
It is goat. Oh, and another one came that was goat. It came to the verses. How does the goat versus the fish? How does that goat versus the fish?
Oh, this goat. This is a happy, wonderful, frolicking goat that enjoys life and enjoys the fish, and that's why he is goat.
And the goat did show the fish that it was enjoying so much being a goat, that was versus the fish, that the fish did behold the enjoyment of the goat, and it did question its own very fish. Do I enjoy being a fish? Do I enjoy being a fish? Should I even be versus the goat? Oh, what is this fish? What is this fish? The feelings of being goat of the goat did make the fish feel that it was less of a fish, and oh, it was seeming that it was a versus of goat. It was seeming it was a versus of goat, but the verses continues. The verses continues with a third choosing.
The third selection is fence sitter. Interesting.
Tell us of this fence sitter, yes? Is it the same fence sitter with new ponderings, or is it yet another fence sitter?
It might be another fence sitter, but it could be the ponderings of a person of a one who, knowing the optimism of the goat and understanding the love of frolic, thought to themselves, if I am a goat, what about all of the great aspects of the fish? Maybe I still want to enjoy things that the fish enjoys. Maybe I still am and still can be fish, and therefore questioned its own goatness to try to become fish. But since it started as goat, it only could end up as a fence sitter.
Ah, it was goat, but now it became fence sitter. Ah,
Became
now
fence
perhaps
sitter.
becoming fish. Perhaps becoming fish. Ah.
The becoming.
The becoming of fish. There are two more choosings in this verses. The goat and fish still versing. The fish still reeling from the verses of feeling that the goat is so confident a goat. The fourth choosing of the verses. Could it be goat or fish?
The fourth selection. fence sitter.
Oh, it is the fence times. Oh, it is the fence times. It is the third fence sitter. It is the third fence sitter. Oh, tell us of this fence sitter.
The third fence sitter, knowing it is the fourth selection, is a typical fence sitter from Hollywood, for it is the dramatic fence sitter. It is the one that understands that if it is a fence sitter in the fourth selection, then the fifth selection will be the all-knowing and all-deciding selection. Therefore, to build up the excitement and the drama of goat versus fish, the fourth fence sitter appears.
It savors goat versus fish.
Savors it. To make the fifth selection all the more satisfying in its selectivity.
The goat is versus the fish. The fish is versus the goat. It does seem to be a versus of goat. There is one goat. There are three fence sitters. The fifth choosing. The fifth choosing. The fifth and final choosing of the verses. Are you ready? Are you ready, one Brett My Pants?
I am ready, and I am making the final selection. The final selection is fish.
It is fish! Oh, it is fish! Oh, it is fish!
It is fish.
And the fish had heard that the goat was so pleased to be a goat. But then it thought of its own very fish. It thought of its own very fish. How does the fish versus the goat? How does the fish versus the goat?
This was a beautiful process. Because of the optimism of the goat in the second selection, the love of frolic, and the enjoyment of life breathing the air and warmth of the sunshine, made the fish ponder its own fishiness and choose possibly to become a goat itself. But in the end, it understood that the reason that the goat was so optimistic and enjoyed itself so much was because it embraced its own goatness. And for the fish to be truly happy wasn't to try to be something it wasn't, a goat. It was to be something that it was all along, a fish. So the fifth selection is the happy, the optimistic, the all-knowing and all-loving fish.
And the fish looked at the goat and said to the goat, "Oh, you think it is so pleasing to be goat? Oh, you think it is so pleasing to be goat? Well, I am a fish. I am a fish, and I am so fish in my fish that this goat cannot even comprehend what it is to be fish because, oh, I am a fish." And in this verses, there was a goat and a fish and three fence sitters, but none did triumph, the goat or the fish. Oh, goat versus fish suspects that soon you will be asked the one true question, and then we shall find out who does triumph in the verses. Do not see one that breats its pants. Do not see it. The verses is before you. The verses is before you. The goat and the fish, both confident they are goat and fish, have been versing. They verses forever verses. They verses forever verses. But they look to you. They look to you. They look directly to you. And goat versus fish called out from the verses. 1. Brett My Pants. Are you goat or are you fish?
I am goat.
It is a goat! It is a goat! I goat for this goat! I goat for this goat! I goat for this goat! Oh, it is a goat! Oh, it is a goat! Oh, we come to celebrate the goat! We come to celebrate
goat, 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 goat. I'm a goat. I'm a goat. Goating goat. Goat, 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 goat.
And just when it seems that the goat and fish would verses, and that there would be none to triumph in the verses, one that was called Brett My Pants did say that it was a goat. How do you versus the fish? How do you triumph over the fish?
It was very simple in the end. Of all of the things I have been contemplating and pondering on goat or fish, it came down to one thing. As I looked at all of the verses, the three fence sitters, the one goat, the one fish. That was all the same. That was equal. So that was of no help in deciding. And then I looked at the fish and I looked at the goat. And you said, Goat versus Fish, you said to me that the goat and the fish looked directly at me.
Yes.
And when they looked directly at me, I looked at them, and I noticed that the goat, with its two eyeballs facing frontwards in a land-based mammal sort of fashion, was looking deeply into my soul, while the fish, in all of its shiny beauty, was its eyeballs were on the side of its head, so it was kind of actually looking over to the left and over to the right and wasn't looking directly at me. That's when I knew I was goat.
It is goat, it is goat. The goat, the goat, the goat do triumph. The goat do triumph over the fish. The goat, the goat, the goat do triumph. The goat do triumph over the fish.
Yeah.
The goat, the goat, the goat do triumph. The goat do triumph over the fish.
The goat.
The goat, the goat,
The goat.
the goat do triumph.
Go,
The
go, go,
goat do triumph
Go, go, go,
over
go,
the
go.
fish. Oh, the goat do triumph over the fish.
Anyways,
The goat do triumph over the fish.
All goat.
Goat. How does it
Yes.
feel to be goat?
It's really just beginning to sink in right now. I think that my guess is that, maybe later tonight and tomorrow, and then again in a week or two, a month, a year passes, and it starts to feel like a normal part of me that I understand that I am goat. But right now, being goat, it's so overwhelming. I'm not sure I'm able to really grasp it. But I will tell you this, Goat versus Fish, that when I came here, I thought I was already goat. And then, after listening to your ponderings and poring over the evidence of the verses, I thought that maybe I had made a mistake and that maybe I was fish and that this is where it was going to go. And it wasn't until the very last moment when the goat looked deep inside of me to let me know that I had been goat all the time and that I was right when I knew that I was goat. It was telling me, yes, Brett, you are goat. And yes, trust your instincts, trust your gut, trust your goat gut, because your goat gut will never lie to you. And also, goat cheese is very delicious.
Ah, is that so? Yes, Goat versus Fish would like to consume the cheese, you say, of the goat.
Cheese of the goat is... Mwah.
The time has come, goat, fish, and fence sitter alike, to celebrate Goat versus Fish. The goat have triumphed this versus. The goat have triumphed over the fish. And there was celebration of goat. There was celebration of goat. But now is the versus to celebrate Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish leaves it to this goat with its newfound goat to celebrate Goat versus Fish. Are you prepared to celebrate Goat versus Fish?
I think life is a celebration. So yes, I am definitely prepared.
The celebration of the goat.
Oh, yes. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Woo! Yes! Goat, baby. That felt good. Real nice.
That was a celebration. That was a celebration of goat. Now, Goat versus Fish knows that you are your own goat and you have your own celebrations. Yes, you have your own celebrations. So do not take this in a fancy way from Goat versus Fish, but you did say that it was good, yes, and in the beginning of Goat versus Fish said there is no good or evil, there is only goat and fish. But it was a small fanciness. It was a very pleasant verses of goat. Oh, it was a pleasant verses of goat.
What I would say to that is that is just evidence of the fact that no matter how far you are in your goat versus fish teachings, that there is always more to learn. There is always more goat and there is always more fish. So therefore, even though you think you have declared yourself goat, as I have, you think that goat has triumphed over fish, and you think that you are ready to be goat. What you are really ready for is just more goat versus fish.
More goat versus fish, more goat versus fish. Well, goat versus fish is going to put you to verses on this. If you say that it is always for more goat versus fish, then it is another versus for you. What do you say to the goat?
To the goat, I say thank you. You have served us, and you are there for us, and we love you.
What do you say to the fish?
You fish are delicious. You have nourished me, literally nourished me. I couldn't have become goat without you, fish.
That is high verses. That is high verses from this goat. What do you say to the fence sitter?
Quit fucking around. You're goat or fish. It's goat versus fish, fence sitter. Yuck.
And what do you say to goat versus fish?
To goat versus fish, I just want to say one thing. Goat versus fish.
You know, Goat versus Fish has asked so many goats, so many fish, even a fence sitter, what they have to say to goat and fish and fence sitter, and what they have to say to goat versus fish. And you are the first one who has said to goat versus fish, goat versus fish. Thank you for joining Goat versus Fish. These are the verses of Goat vs. Fish. Subscribe, rate, and review the Goat vs. Fish podcast on the YouTube and the iTunes. Follow Goat vs. Fish on all social media. On the Instagram, on the Book of Faces, on the Twitter, all at Goat vs. Fish, all at GoatVsFish, and even on the Twitch. And if you wish to witness a live versus of Goat vs. Fish at one of the comedy places or conventions, go to GoatVsFish.com to find all places and times of future verses. The theme celebration for this versus was an offering by McHenry on SoundCloud, who is a fish. Join the Goat vs. Fish discussion group on the Book of Faces to discuss Goat vs. Fish with other goat and fish and even a fence sitter. And when you are out in the land and the sea, look about you. Look about you. Find one who is lost. Find one who does not know the way. And ask. Simply ask,
Are you goat or are you fish?
Thank you for joining Goat vs. Fish. I am Goat vs. Fish, the GoatFish.
And it was written, and it was written.
That is all for Goat vs. Fish. That is all for Goat vs. Fish.